Today's submitted material explores the inevitable transition of financial operations from manual, rule-based execution to real-time automated systems where human professionals are elevated to govern the architecture.
Right, and we're jumping straight into the feedback today because, frankly, the material makes a really strong authoritative case for automation as an elevation of human talent rather than a threat.
It really does.
But there are specific ways we can push these insights from good to truly exceptional by addressing the messy realities of how this shift actually happens on the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. So a key theme running through this material seems to be this profound professional identity shift.
Mm-hmm.
The author spends like a significant amount of time detailing how finance professionals must transition from being data producers, people who reconcile ledgers and manually check compliance,
Right.
into what they call intelligence interpreters and architecture governors.
Which is a beautiful vision. I mean, it really is.
It is. But as I was reading, I couldn't help but feel a certain, cognitive dissonance.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, it feels a bit like expecting a traditional paper map maker to seamlessly become a GPS satellite engineer overnight.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a great way to frame it.
Right. The destination is clear, but the journey seems entirely too smooth. I mean, a map maker understands terrain visually, right? They observe a fixed landscape and draw it.
Yeah.
But governing orbital telemetry requires understanding like algorithmic latency and dynamic data feeds. You don't just put down the drafting pen, look at a satellite screen, and immediately know how to operate it.
Exactly. And that actually brings us to the first major point. The conceptual argument for elevating human roles is highly persuasive, but the material glosses over the friction and timeline of this transition.
Yeah.
The weakness here is the minimization of operational friction. I mean, the submission paints this slightly utopian before and after picture.
It really does. It's like, here's the bad old days of spreadsheets, and boom, now we're digital architects.
Right. We have the before, fraught with manual inefficiency, and then suddenly the after, where our former data entry clerks are calmly governing complex, real-time automated architectures.
It reads like a seamless software update.
Exactly. Rather than an epistemological shift in how a human being processes information, it completely overlooks the realities of the training lag, the psychological resistance, and honestly, the sheer complexity of managing the transition period.
Yeah, where these vastly different skill sets are overlapping.
Right. We're talking about changing the fundamental wiring of how a department operates. Sending someone to a 2-day workshop does not turn them from a rule applier into an exception handler.
No, definitely not. A rule applier looks at an invoice, sees it matches a purchase order, and clicks approve. It's binary.
But then an exception handler, they see an algorithm flag a complex cross-border tax anomaly that contradicts local law, but maybe aligns with a new international treaty?
And they have to make a judgment call right then and there.
Exactly. That requires immense contextual reasoning that takes years to cultivate.
But hold on, let me play devil's advocate for a second.
Sure.
If we shine a massive spotlight on the pain and friction of this transition, don't we risk alienating the reader?
What do you mean?
Well, if I am a CFO reading this, and the text tells me that implementing this real-time system is going to plunge my department into an extended period of chaos and steep learning curves, I might just close the document.
And stick with the broken spreadsheets?
Yeah. Does highlighting the struggle undermine the case for change?
I mean, that is a valid concern, but glossing over the struggle actually destroys the author's credibility.
Oh, that's a good point.
If the reader is currently drowning in the chaos of modernizing their finance department, and the text pretends that phase barely exists, the reader will assume the author has never actually done this in the real world.
Right. They'll just think it's academic theory.
Exactly. So the suggestion here is to explicitly introduce the concept of the messy middle to make the piece more grounded and realistic for organizations currently in the trenches.
I love that phrase, the messy middle.
Yeah, and if I were editing this, I would advise the author to add a dedicated section discussing the challenge of managing hybrid environments.
Because you don't just flip a switch and turn off all the manual processes on a Friday.
Never. Legacy manual processes must temporarily coexist with new real-time agents like continuous transaction controls. Managing the data flow between those two things is incredibly stressful.
Walk us through the physics of that hybrid environment. What exactly makes that clash so volatile?
Well, think about how continuous transaction controls, or CTCs, actually operate technically compared to traditional batch processing.
Okay.
In the old batch processing world, a company finalized its books at the end of the month, sent the data to the government, and maybe dealt with an audit 2 years later.
Right, it was entirely retrospective.
Exactly. But a CTC environment is real time. The government is essentially embedded in the transaction itself.
So when you purchase inventory, the government's automated system validates the tax code in milliseconds?
Yes! Before the invoice is even legally cleared. Now imagine a hybrid environment where a finance team is still using like a manual spreadsheet workaround to calculate regional tax variations.
Oh, man.
But the government's API is demanding validated data in milliseconds. A human typing numbers into cells simply cannot operate at the speed of a digital clearance model.
They just physically can't. Acknowledging that highly specific operational clash instantly builds trust, I think.
It really does. It shows the reader we understand the physics of their daily nightmare.
That bridges the gap between the map maker and the satellite engineer. You have to talk about the awkward phase where they're trying to draw a paper map while the landscape is shifting in real time beneath them.
Exactly. And building on that, the author needs to address the realistic timeline of capability development.
Right.
Describe the friction of someone being presented with an anomaly by an automated system for the first time and just freezing because they are used to executing a known rule, not exercising ambiguous judgment.
Yeah, naming that cognitive friction makes the ultimate elevation of the role feel earned and achievable rather than, magical.
Totally. It brings a much-needed sense of gravity to the transformation.
Okay, so if we are going to acknowledge that chaotic, messy middle, we need to look at how the author guides the reader through it organizationally.
Right.
Let's look closely at the section discussing the practical starting point. Because, and this drove me crazy, this sits at the very end of the document.
Yes.
The author spends pages and pages detailing the existential threat of millisecond-level regulatory requirements. The reader is practically sweating wondering how to survive this landscape.
And yet the actual how-to, the practical steps to take, is buried at the finish line.
Exactly. The highly actionable, practical advice for implementing this transition feels buried beneath the high-level strategic theory.
Yeah. That's clearly laid out. I wonder, though, if we've considered that the most usable advice in the entire submission is tucked away.
It really is.
Because the author makes a brilliant counterintuitive point in that section. They advise the reader to start automating the most exposed process rather than the most expensive one.
Which is huge. That is the kind of insight a finance leader desperately needs.
Absolutely. But to get to it, the reader has to wade through all these extensive theoretical sections about deliberate design and architecture governance.
Right, but are we suggesting ripping the theoretical foundation out entirely and turning this into a shallow listicle?
No, definitely not.
Because if we move the how-to to page 1, doesn't the reader lack the context necessary to understand why they should follow those steps?
Well, yeah, you can't hand someone a fire extinguisher without explaining what a Class A fire is.
Exactly.
We absolutely need the theory, but the structure currently isolates the advice from the problem. The suggestion is to pull that practical implementation strategy forward and weave it directly into the core narrative.
To bridge the gap between the why and the how.
Exactly. Let's look at the mechanics of why that exposed versus expensive insight is so critical to pull forward.
Okay.
In the legacy world of batch processing, what made a process a prime candidate for automation?
Well, historically, it was always cost. The most expensive process usually involved a room full of clerks manually keying in data.
Right? Taking weeks to reconcile accounts.
Yeah, so automation was deployed just to eliminate that sheer volume of human labor hours.
Exactly. But in a real-time clearance model, the calculus changes entirely. An exposed process might only take one person 5 minutes a day to execute manually.
So it's very cheap.
Right, very cheap. But if that manual execution fails or is delayed in a millisecond-level regulatory environment, it halts physical operations.
Yeah, a blocked digital transaction literally stops a physical truck from leaving a loading dock.
The blast radius of an exposed process is immediate, systemic failure.
Which is why hiding that specific strategic pivot at the end of the document really stalls the momentum.
It really does.
We need to restructure the narrative so that the section titled 3 Ways Manual Processes Fail, which lists speed, key person dependency, and non-audit ready evidence, immediately sets up the practical starting point as the direct solution.
Yes, because right now, the failure section just sits there as a list of problems.
Right. Once you prove that a manual process fails because it cannot possibly match regulatory speed, you must immediately follow up with the advice to automate the most exposed speed-sensitive process first.
Link the disease directly to the cure.
Exactly. That creates a much tighter logical loop. You establish the specific mechanism of failure, and then you provide the strategic lever to fix it. It empowers the reader.
Furthermore, I would actually advise creating a visually distinct, bolded framework earlier in the text.
Oh, like step-by-step guide?
Yeah, something like that. Phase 1, identify the highest risk exposure. Phase 2, invest in the human capability to govern it. Phase 3, deploy the automation.
I like that. Establishing that clear methodology early on gives the reader mental scaffolding.
Exactly. And then when the author eventually dives into the deeper, abstract theory of architecture governance later in the piece, the reader understands exactly where that theory fits into the operational roadmap.
That transforms the text from a theoretical white paper into a strategic playbook.
Totally.
Okay, so now that we have pulled the practical roadmap forward, let's look at how we communicate the urgency of taking that first step.
Yeah.
Okay, so what I really like about this part is the author's identification of tacit knowledge.
Oh, yeah.
It's this fleeting mention of the specific person who knows exactly which supplier codes need overriding, or the controller who knows which intercompany accounts have timing differences.
It's a highly recognizable human detail.
It is. The entire department's compliance often rests entirely on one person's memory.
The load-bearing employee phenomenon.
Exactly. But the author introduces this great human detail and then immediately zooms back out to a 30,000-foot view.
Yeah, the risk remains largely abstract.
The narrative relies heavily on abstract organizational consequences while underutilizing the relatable, human stakes of this shift.
Building on that point, what if we looked at it from the perspective of visceral impact? Because the weakness here is a stark lack of that felt reality.
Yeah, the text frequently mentions rejected invoices, operational disruptions, and compliance failures.
Right, which are factual statements of structural risk, but they are completely sterile.
They are. An executive reads operational disruption, and they just intellectualize it.
The risk is stated factually, but it is not felt viscerally. And organizations do not feel pain, people do.
Okay, but is it really the job of a high-level strategic finance document to tell campfire stories?
What do you mean?
Well, does a narrative vignette truly belong in thought leadership aimed at data-driven executives? Aren't they swayed by metrics and risk registers rather than creative writing exercises?
I mean, executives justify their decisions with metrics, but they make those decisions based on felt urgency.
A client's failure is just a line item on a risk register that gets reviewed quarterly. But a panicked phone call at 4 p.m. on a Friday because the company is locked out of a market and supply lines are frozen?
That's a felt reality.
Exactly. That is a felt reality that drives immediate budget approval. Abstract language creates this psychological distance that allows the reader to think, well, our controls are strong enough, that won't happen to us.
Right. So the suggestion is to ground this theoretical risk in a brief, concrete scenario or vignette to heighten the stakes and demonstrate the real-world pressure.
Exactly. Let's actually trace the mechanics of what that vignette should look like.
Okay.
Let's take the key person dependency point. The author should expand this by depicting a highly specific, stressful scenario.
Like the senior tax specialist who knows how to manually correct a stubborn ERP field?
Yes. Detail the exact chronological sequence of failure when that specialist is out sick on the exact day a new real-time validation rule goes live.
In a jurisdiction with continuous transaction controls.
Exactly. Paint the picture of that cascade.
Okay, so the specialist is out,
Right.
and because they're out, the ERP field isn't manually corrected.
Which means the system generates an XML file with a null value in a mandatory field.
And the company's software sends that payload to the government's API.
Right, and because this is a real-time clearance model, the government's algorithm rejects the payload in under 50 milliseconds.
The clearance status is instantly marked as denied.
And because the clearance is denied, the logistics software refuses to generate a bill of lading.
And because there is no bill of lading, physical trucks loaded with perishable goods just sit idle on the tarmac.
Boom. Suddenly, one employee's sick day hasn't just caused a reconciliation error, it has completely halted the physical supply chain.
That vignette takes the concept of tacit knowledge risk from an academic observation to a vivid, terrifying reality.
It really does. It proves the author's core thesis. In a real-time world, a manual failure isn't a month-end problem, it is an immediate operational halt.
And it sets up such a powerful contrast, too.
How so?
Well, once the text has established the fragility of the manual system through that vignette, it should contrast it directly with a vignette of the new, elevated finance professional.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, show this architecture governor calmly handling a genuinely exceptional anomaly.
Right. Show the automated system processing 99.9% of the routine transactions flawlessly.
Exactly. Then, show the system flagging one highly complex, ambiguous regulatory conflict, like a scenario where a local mandate contradicts an international trade agreement.
And then show the human professional using deep contextual reasoning and strategic oversight to resolve it.
Yes, that explicitly demonstrates the difference between the mapmaker and the satellite engineer.
You show, rather than just tell, what the elevation of the role actually looks like in practice.
Exactly. When you juxtapose the cascade of failure caused by the manual workaround against the calm, strategic governance of the automated architecture, the reader doesn't just intellectually understand the transition.
They desperately want to execute it.
Exactly. Well, we have explored a significant amount of the underlying mechanics today, really analyzing the structural, pacing, and narrative elements of this submission.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground.
To bring these observations together, this material provides a highly compelling, authoritative look at the future of finance. The foundational arguments regarding the shift from manual execution to architectural governance are incredibly strong.
They absolutely are.
However, the piece can be elevated significantly by pulling the reader out of the sterile realm of abstract theory and grounding them in the visceral, friction-filled reality of the transition.
So to give the listener a clear playbook for their next draft, first, don't hide the messy middle.
Lean into the operational friction.
Right. Explicitly map out the realities of hybrid environments where legacy spreadsheets violently clash with millisecond-level automated agents. And acknowledge the steep cognitive learning curve required to turn rule appliers into exception handlers.
Second, restructure the pacing by pulling the practical where to start advice forward.
Move that brilliant insight about targeting the most exposed processes rather than the most expensive ones out of the conclusion.
Yeah, and weave it directly into the core body to bridge the why and the how. Connect the failure mechanisms directly to the strategic levers.
And third, use brief, vivid vignettes of key person dependency failures to strip away the psychological distance of abstract risk.
Show the exact cascade of how a missing manual input freezes a physical supply chain.
Exactly.
We warmly invite the listener to apply these structural and narrative adjustments. And please submit your revised work back in for another round of feedback in a future critique.
Yeah, we really want to see how these concepts evolve.
Because ultimately, guiding a reader through a profound professional transformation requires more than just pointing to a frictionless destination on a map.
You have to acknowledge exactly how difficult it is to let go of the tools that got them here.
And show them precisely how to govern the new systems that will take them forward. Until next time.